Everyone. So today we are starting to look at chapter 10, Jacksonian America. This is America under the presidency of Andrew Jackson. So there are 4 sections. So today you're going to do 10.1 and 10.2. Tomorrow you'll do 10.3. Monday you'll do 10.4. Tuesday, you'll review for your chapter 10 test, and then Wednesday, take your chapter 10 test. So let's go ahead and start looking at 10.1 and into good feelings. So the end of James Monroe, end of this period of this era of good feelings. Good feelings, whether between individuals or nations, are often hard to maintain. James Monroe and his successor, John Quincy Adams, soon saw the nation harmony turn to discord. The problems of national government loomed again as the sections of the United States dealt with increasing political differences. So we're looking here at the candidates in the 1824 election. The most important issues in the 1824 campaign were the tariff and internal improvements, such as building roads, canals, and bridges. So looking at the different candidates, the Democratic Republicans chose William Crawford, who was the current Secretary of Treasury, as their candidate. The other candidates were all popular regional politicians, meaning in the regions that they were from, they were popular. So John Quincy Adams of Massachusetts was a career diplomat. His father was John Adams, the first vice president, the second president. Henry Clay from Kentucky was the Speaker of the House. Andrew Jackson, his slogan became Old Hickory, the nation's hero and the people's friend. All right, so in the election of 1824, Jackson won more votes than anyone else in both the Electoral College and the popular vote, but there was no majority in the electoral vote. And because of that, the election went to this House of Representatives. The 12th Amendment gave each state 1 vote in such a situation. The states would choose the president from among the top 3 candidates. So the top 3 candidates were John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and William Crawford. So Henry Clay, he was automatically out. He was not in the top 3. He's still the Speaker of the House, though. Jackson's followers believed that the House had a moral responsibility to pick the man with the largest vote. The founders, however, wanted the 12th Amendment to serve as a check on the populace. The most important factor in the House's decision turned out to be Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House. Whomever Clay chose to support with his votes would be the winner. Since his views were closest to Adams and since he distrusted Jackson's abilities to be president, Clay chose to support Adams, making Adams the winner of the election of 1824. When Adams became president, he kept most of Monroe's cabinet. He replaced only 3 men, and he had to get someone to replace himself as Secretary of State. Although Monroe told him that making Henry Clay Secretary of State might be an unwise political move, Adams chose Clay because of his qualifications and experience. That decision proved to be a problem for Adams. Jackson's followers angrily charged Adams and Clay of making a corrupt bargain. They thought that Adams and Clay had made a deal in which Clay would support Adams for president in return for a high political appointment. Adams was both hurt and horrified by the accusations. His supporters believed that his strong conscience and devotion to duty would never have allowed him to make such a deal. An angry Andrew Jackson resigned his Senate seat and set out for Tennessee. His supporters started organizing for the 1828 election, plotting Adams' political demise. So looking at John Quincy Adams' presidency. He'd been a public servant for 36 years before becoming president. He has served in the Department of State during every presidential administration. Probably the best educated man of his day, he had an enviable political record, but he seemed cold and aloft and unexciting. He refused to give out jobs as rewards, even though other politicians did so. And he did his best to work behind the scenes, or he did his best work behind the scenes. Although he would have appreciated praise and honors from others, he did not actively seek recognition. His single term of office turned into a series of unending disasters. He was not sensitive to changing opinions and trends, and he designed his political program to improve the national economy. Henry Clay suggested what he called the American system, a high-tariff package to pay for internal improvements. Adams endorsed the plan. He thought that after the nation repaid the public debt, there would be funds left from the tariff and the sale of public lands. He believed that the nation could use those funds to build roads and canals to aid the communication between distant regions and multitudes of men. Adams' critics made, let me back up. Adams also wanted to build lighthouses along the coast to aid shipping, and he wanted to create a national university to improve the minds of Americans. He wanted to build an observatory for viewing and studying the skies as well. But many people were more interested in their own sections of the country than in the nation as a whole. Adams' critics made fun of his lighthouses in the sky, as well as his suggestion that Congress should promote art, literature, and science. The people did not accept Adams' ideas. In the 1826 midterm congressional elections, he lost most of his support in Congress. The Southerners called the high-tariff package, which was passed in 1828, the tariff of abominations, and threatened to leave the Union. Abominations means bad. Whenever I see the word abominations, I always think about the abominable snowman that you see on Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. So abomination is bad. And the tariff would force them to pay higher prices for items they needed, and thus would hurt their economy. President Adams may have disagreed with aspects of this particular tariff package. In 1832, after he left office, Adams supported efforts to lower the tariff rates. However, he did not consider it unconstitutional, and he signed this bill despite Southern opposition. Although Adams had vast experience in diplomacy, he faced difficulties in foreign affairs. Early in his administration, the Creek Indians appealed to him for an annulment of an illegally secured treaty that would move them off their lands. Adams secured the annulment, but he did so at a political cost. The annulment angered those who wanted to see the Indians moved west. Adams also faced opposition in Pan American Conference held in Panama, but he was able to see the 9 trade agreements negotiated, in which the U.S. and other countries agreed to lower the tariffs they placed on one another's goods. These successes, however, were overshadowed by Adams' failure to reopen the British West Indies to American trade. His career, though, continued after he left the White House. He was known as the president who never retired. In 1830, he ran for Congress for his home district in Massachusetts. He wrote, "No person could be degraded by serving the people in Congress." All right, so now looking at the election of 1828. By the end of Adams' term, 2 political parties existed once again. You have the National Republican Party, which chose Adams for the 1828 election. The Tennessee legislator named Andrew Jackson. Soon, other supportive state legislators placed these men on their ballots. Jackson's group, which was made up mostly of former Democratic Republicans, called itself the Democratic Party. Parties use broadsides, which are posters, banners, editorials, and testimonials to present their points of view. They also held barbecues, banquets, and torchlight parties to win voter support. Mudslinging or making malicious statements about opponents became popular. So Jackson won the election with 178 electoral votes. Every southern and western state and New York and Pennsylvania voted for him. His appeal to the common man and his campaign against Adams and the aristocracy were successful. Unfortunately, his wife Rachel died on December 22nd. Jackson took office a few weeks later, and for the first time and for the rest of his life, he blamed the National Republicans for causing her death. Although the candidates were not directly involved in the mudslinging, much of which was directed at his wife, Rachel, they allowed the attacks to continue when they could have used their leadership to stop them. All right, so that is the end of section 1. Now we're looking at 10.2, the people's president. Jackson claimed to be champion of the common man. He placed great trust in popular opinion. After he took office, he boldly made changes that he believed the people wanted. These changes represented a shift towards democracy. The more Republican form of government favored by George Washington and John Adams had placed less trust in the people and had placed more responsibility on the leaders to discern between right and wrong. Jackson used the powers of the presidency more than anyone else before him. He made friends and enemies easily. He turned his thoughts into action so swiftly, he sometimes seemed reckless and unthinking. And he had a short temper, which he never really learned to control. One thing that is important to point out before I go any further, democracy sometimes can become mob rule, meaning this is where the masses rule, whether right or wrong, the squeaky wheel gets taken care of. But America's foundation is a republic. This is where the people elect a representative who will do the best for the people, even if it may not necessarily be what they want at the time. But that is why you have to elect someone who is going to do what is right and just. A democracy, rule falls completely with the people. But depending on what people want and how they go about trying to get it, it may not necessarily be the right thing. So Jackson is advocating more here for the people being in charge. And with that, sometimes does not come the best decisions. So before becoming president, Jackson had been a lawyer, judge, land speculator, politician, Indian fighter, and planner. He was the first president from a state west of the original 13 states and the first president from a poor family. At the beginning of his administration, Jackson replaced nearly 1,000 government workers with his followers. The act of handing out government jobs to loyal followers is known as the spoil system. It was not new. Earlier officials had often replaced workers who retired or died with supporters. Only John Quincy Adams stood out for choosing workers based on their merits alone. Jackson, however, took the step of removing some government workers from their positions and replacing them with his supporters. In effect, the spoil system was a way to get rid of officials who might not support the new president. The spoil system aided in the growth of political machines or organized groups of politicians who sought to control the government. And also, instead of consulting his formally appointed cabinet, which is required by the Constitution, it's required that a president have a cabinet. And he had this cabinet and he appointed these men, but he rarely consulted them. Instead, he went to a group of close advisors, another group of men that became known as his kitchen cabinet. Now, why would Jackson point these men into a position but yet not consult them? Why didn't he consult this other group, or why didn't he appoint this other group of men to be consulted, to be part of his cabinet instead? It could have been a political move on his part, lots of different reasons it could have happened. So as I said, these group became known as Jackson's kitchen cabinet. All right, so many Americans wanted to remove the Indians from their lands, and Jackson agreed with this view and acted on it. Remember how we talked about a lot of times he put his thoughts into action, sometimes with tragic results, and that's what happened here. In the late 1820s, the Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Cherokees still own significant portions of land in the eastern U.S. Some Americans thought that the Indians should be educated and taught to live like white Americans so that someday they could become U.S. citizens. Now, the Cherokees were not a military threat to Americans, to the U.S. After the Americans won independence from Britain, the Cherokees made a peace treaty with the U.S. They also helped Andrew Jackson defeat the Red Stick Creeks in the War of 1812. The Cherokees also adopted many American customs. In the early 1820s, Sequoyah, a Cherokee scholar, developed a writing system for them. The system enabled them to print a newspaper. In 1827, they wrote a constitution for their nation. The document was modeled on the U.S. Constitution. The Cherokees built towns and farms and developed trading relationships with Americans. The Cherokees were also open to the gospel. Many of them converted to Christianity, and their towns included Christian churches. In 1828, the Georgia legislature passed a law placing the Cherokee lands under Georgian law. This new law violated federal treaties that the U.S. had made with Cherokees, but Jackson let it stand because he believed the Indians were subjects of the U.S. Yet the United States had signed almost 100 treaties with the Indians during Jackson's presidency, showing that it viewed the Indian tribes as foreign nations. You don't make treaties with your own citizens. You don't, like the federal government would not come and make treaties with us because we are American citizens. There's no reason to make treaties with us. But it made these treaties with the Indians, showing that they viewed the Indians as a foreign nation, not as part of the United States. So Jackson is kind of speaking out of both sides of his mouth here. He's calling them American citizens, yet at the same time, he's not treating them like they are American citizens. And in the spring of 1829, gold was discovered on Cherokee land and prospectors moved in. Jackson withdrew federal troops and asserted that the only way to protect the Cherokees was to move them west. In 1830, Congress passed and Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which said that the Indians who left their lands east of the Mississippi would be given lands west of the Mississippi. And it said that the national government would pay the cost of moving and the cost of the first year of settlement. It did not force the Indians to move, but Jackson said that the U.S. would no longer honor treaties that promised the Indians protections from trespassers. So several missionaries were arrested for ministering among the Cherokees. Georgia had passed a law that forbid white people to live among the Cherokees unless these people affirmed the supremacy of Georgia laws over Cherokees. And two of these missionaries were sentenced to serve 4 years at hard labor. Their names were Samuel Worcester and Elijah Butler. They appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the missionaries. In Worcester v. Georgia, Chief Justice John Marshall ordered Georgia to release the missionaries and told President Jackson to send troops into Georgia to remove white prospectors from Cherokee lands. But Georgia and President Jackson ignored the court. Jackson reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." In which we know that the Supreme Court has no way of being able to enforce their opinions. Many Cherokees still held out, but by 1838, the U.S. Army and Georgian troops had forcibly moved those who had not already gone west to the Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. U.S. soldiers dragged the Cherokees from their homes, sometimes at gunpoint, and placed them in detention camps until the marches west began. The forced marches west began in summer, and sickness and drought killed many of the travelers. Several groups waited until fall, but heavy rains became a problem. Travel was difficult and food was scarce. As winter set in, frigid weather and bad water caused more disease. About 4,000 Cherokees died en route to the Indian Territory. The Indians called the relocation the Trail of Tears. All right, the Black Hawk War. Although the Indians were unsuccessful in resisting the advance of white settlers, they tried. Black Hawk, an Indian leader of the Sauk and Fox tribes of northern Illinois, led a resistance. Black Hawk had fought alongside the British in the War of 1812 and was a friend of Tecumseh. But after the U.S. forced the Indians from their lands and moved them to the Iowa Territory, Black Hawk and his followers found themselves facing starvation. In 1832, Black Hawk and about 400 other Indians returned to their lands in search of food. The settlers in the area panicked, viewing the return as an act of war. They called out the army, and a force of militiamen organized the battle Black Hawk's band. Black Hawk fled with his band to the swamps of Wisconsin. The army and the militia pursued. Black Hawk retreated across the river to safety, but later the militia cornered him and attacked, killing almost all of his followers. Black Hawk escaped the Bad Axe Massacre, as this battle was called, but he later surrendered to a band of Winnebago Indians who turned him over to authorities. All right, and that is the end of our 10.2 notes. So tomorrow you will pick back up with 10.3. Monday you will do 10.4. You'll review for your test on Tuesday and take your chapter 10 test on Wednesday. So y'all have a good rest of your day. Thanks. All right, so now we're going to pick up on 10.3 today, looking at internal controversies. These are problems that Jackson had in his presidency inside our country. There were two controversial issues that arose during Jackson's presidency. One of the most important issues concerned the states and their rights in relation to the power of the federal government. The other issue was the future of the national bank. The states' rights issue came to a head as Congress considered the use of tariffs. Americans eagerly awaited Jackson's opinion on this important national issue. So if you remember, there's two different kinds of tariff. There's revenue tariffs and there are protective tariffs. Revenue tariffs are designed to raise money, whereas a protective tariff is designed to protect the home industry. It's often a higher tariff that is designed to pretty much keep foreign competition from being able to come into the country in order to allow the home industry to make more money and get stronger. So Congress had passed a revenue tariff during Washington's presidency. But by Jackson's time, different sections of the country disagreed sharply on the value and purpose of tariffs. The nation began using tariffs to limit the importation of foreign goods. This, the protective tariff that we talked about, it raised the price of those foreign goods. Northern industries wanted to keep Americans from buying foreign goods so that you would buy from them instead. So they fought to keep the protective tariff. Because the South had remained agriculture, it needed to buy most of its manufactured goods from either the North or foreign countries. So, and of course, they wanted to be able to pay the cheapest thing that they could. They still wanted good quality, but they wanted cheap. So this tariff kind of prevented them from being able to get things cheaply. The Southerners depended on the profits they made from their crops to pay for those goods. The high tariff increased their let me back up. The high tariff increased their costs and decreased both their profits and their trade with foreign countries. The foreign countries were upset about the protective tariffs as much as the South was. A lot of times they refused to buy goods from America because of those protective tariffs. So selling cotton became more difficult as trade declined with these foreign countries. Cotton prices fell. These economic problems and worry over the continued existence of slavery increased political tensions. They also brought a stronger defense of states' rights. John C. Calhoun, Jackson's vice president, became the leading defender of states' rights. The South Carolina legislature had formed a committee that studied the tariff problem. It asked Calhoun, who was from South Carolina, to write the final report. The report said that the people of South Carolina or anyone else in the minority could protect themselves by nullifying tariffs or laws that might hurt them. According to the theory of nullification, a state to declare federal law unconstitutional by refusing to enforce it. Calhoun thought that the nullification would satisfy the South by allowing it to protect itself from the ever-growing North without limiting its appeal in the North and the West. He hoped the nullification would help him gain the presidency after Jackson and protect the outnumbered Southerners. But Jackson did not pursue tariff reform. The South tried to gain support for reform by bargaining with the West. The South pushed the West to support a lower tariff in return for Southern support of a free or cheap land policy. Westerners wanted to open more lands to settlement at a low cost. But Northerners opposed the ideas. They feared that their workers would move away to the Western lands. Calhoun's theory came under attack when tariff reform came up for debate in the Senate. In 1830, South Carolina Senator Robert Y. Hayne defended nullification of states' rights. He noted that the states had voluntarily joined the Union. According to the 10th Amendment, the states are the people keeping all powers not given to the national government. Hayne argued that the Constitution does not give the national government power to pass laws that hurt one group of people or region of the country while helping another. Since such laws violate the Constitution, Hayne said the states had the right to nullify and refuse to obey them. Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts attacked nullification point by point, carefully defending his view of the Constitution and the federal union. He said that a state did not have the right to disobey federal law. President Jackson had not yet taken sides in the Senate debate. He had a deep respect for state rights and believed that the South was justified in its complaint about the tariff. But to Jackson, nullification was out of the question. On April 13th, 1830, Democrats gathered for a dinner in honor of their party's founder, Thomas Jefferson. A series of toasts, which are short statements honoring someone, was a regular part of such gatherings. When President Jackson rose to make his toast, he looked squarely at John C. Calhoun and said, "Our federal union, it must and shall be preserved." Calhoun responded, "The union, next to our liberty, most dear." The incident was but one in many in a growing rift between Jackson and Calhoun. So basically what Jackson was saying here is the federal union is most important. It has to be preserved at all costs. And Calhoun is saying, yes, the union is great, but our liberty, our freedoms are better. Eventually, Calhoun resigned the vice presidency. The South Carolina legislature elected him to the Senate, where he led the fight for states' rights. Jackson transferred his favor to his Secretary of State, New Yorker Martin Van Buren. The issue of states' rights simmered dangerously for another 2 years. It boiled over when Congress passed a new tariff in 1832. This tariff gained some support in the South and West because it was lower than the 1828 tariff, but it was still a high tariff on textiles and iron. Congress was still pro-tariff. Nullifiers saw the tariff of 1832 as a direct challenge. When Jackson signed the tariff, they believed that all hope was gone. South Carolina legislature issued a declaration called the Ordinance of Nullification that forbade state and federal officers to collect tariffs in South Carolina after February 1st, 1833. If the federal government tried to force the tariff on South Carolina, the state would issue an order of secession, meaning it would leave the Union. Jackson said that he understood the South Carolinians' plot, but that nullifying a federal law defied the Constitution. He sent a warship and a revenue cutter, which is a federal boat that collected tariffs and ports, to Charleston. He said he would personally take the field if the crisis came to an armed clash, and he threatened to hang John C. Calhoun. The Constitution did not forbid secession, he told South Carolinians, but he told them that their state could not leave the Union. Congress supported Jackson by passing the Force Bill, which allowed him to use the Army and the Navy to enforce the laws. Meanwhile, South Carolina looked for allies. The state called a national convention to support nullification. To its surprise, not one state responded. Although Jackson opposed nullification, he wanted to lower the tariff and simplify government involvement. This attitude allowed Henry Clay, who was adept at settling disputes, to help South Carolina out of its dangerous position. Clay also knew that Jackson wanted to avoid violence. Clay and Calhoun worked out details for a compromise tariff. The new tariff lowered duties gradually. By 1842, no tariff was to be more than 20%. This plan gave the infant industries in the North time to grow stronger before they lost their protection. Congress adopted this compromise of 1833. 2 weeks later, South Carolina withdrew its nullification of the tariff, but it still held the Force Bill to be null and void. Jackson, however, ignored this action. Although Jackson and Clay had managed to keep the Union together, the question of states' rights remained unsettled. Many Southerners still believed that they could leave the Union if they wanted. All right. The National Bank, unlike the election of 1828, the 1832 election featured no mudslinging. More importantly, there was a campaign issue in 1832, the future of the Bank of the United States. Congress had rechartered the bank for 20 more years in 1816. Thus, the bank would cease to exist after 1836 unless Congress renewed its charter and the president endorsed the action. Philadelphia banker Nicholas Biddle was the president of the Bank of the United States in 1832. He had handled the bank skillfully. The bank's 29 branches had efficiently regulated the nation's finances. It was powerful because it controlled 1/5 of all banknotes and 1/3 of bank deposits and coins. Private parties, most of whom were rich Easterners, held 4/5 of the bank's stocks, so the bank was accountable to them. Most of the bank's profits went to these private owners. Biddle, who wanted the bank rechartered before 1836, courted Jackson's favor by making loans to Jackson's supporters. He also suggested that the nation repay its debt by the anniversary of Jackson's victory at New Orleans. Although such goal was dear to Jackson's heart, Biddle did not win him over. Jackson made it known that he disliked all banks, including Biddle's. Although Jackson did not support nullification, he agreed with other Southerners that the government had too much power. He had more faith in the people's ability than in the government's ability to run the nation. So during his presidency, he tried to reduce the government's power, for instance, calling for a lower tariff. He thought that the national bank was just more evidence that the governments had too much power. He thought the national bank was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court had upheld the bank in McCulloch v. Maryland, but Jackson was not impressed. He said, "I have read the opinion of John Marshall and could not agree with him." Jackson's supporters pursued wealth and power as eagerly as Eastern merchants and factory owners did, but they believed that the Easterners were interested in the bank only to gain special privileges and to maintain a monopoly. Jackson had the support of state bankers against the national bank. He led them to believe that Biddle would destroy the state bank by calling in their notes. Although Biddle had never used the bank's power to this end, he did hold this threat over the state banks. The threat had forced the state banks to be more careful in their lending. In addition, New York bankers whose wealth was growing from the Erie Canal trade joined the anti-bank group out of jealous resentment. If Biddle's bank charter expired, New Yorkers thought the bank's business might come their way. So Henry Clay thought he could win the presidency in 1832 and save the bank at the same time by making the bank the central campaign issue. Although Biddle hesitated, he was hesitant to, because if you remember, the charter for the bank doesn't come up until 1836. So you've got 4 years here. So Biddle was hesitant to jump the gun, but Clay went ahead and introduced a bill for the renewal of the bank's charter 4 years ahead of schedule. Congress passed the bill, had strong support from everybody, including Jackson's party, but Jackson still vetoed it. The voters supported Jackson's view in the president election that year. Congress did not override Jackson's decision, and he won 219 electoral votes to Clay's 39. So with his veto, it meant that the National Bank would dissolve after 1836. But that wasn't enough for Jackson. He was out to kill the bank and ruin his enemy, BIDDLE. Jackson ordered the Secretary of Treasury to stop depositing government money in BIDDLE's bank. The government revenues from taxes and land sales would go into new accounts in 89 state banks, which were soon known as Jackson's pet banks. Fearing an economic panic, the secretary refused to follow Jackson's orders. So Jackson fired him and also fired the next Secretary of Treasury because he refused to follow those orders. Jackson's third secretary found a way around legal restrictions by depositing money in pet banks and paying government bills with money from the National Bank. After Jackson stopped putting funds in the National Bank, the bank's balance dropped $17 million in a year's time. Lacking funds and hoping to rebel against Jackson, BIDDLE called in loans owed by state banks. Unfortunately, that recall caused hundreds of state banks to fail and wipe out the savings of thousands of Americans. What Jackson had feared was now a reality, and he was partly to blame for it. BIDDLE soon responded to pressure from angry bankers and other businessmen. Rather than calling money in, he lent it out in an effort to save more banks from failure. In the West, this sudden influx of money led to new problems: inflation and speculation in Western lands. Across the nation, money became freely available to almost anyone who wanted it. More state banks were started. Between 1830 and 1837, the number of state banks grew from 330 to about 800. These banks printed paper money when gold and silver were not available. The rising inflation alarmed Jackson. Now, inflation, simply defined, is an increase in the money supply. Inflation can be produced by increasing the amount of gold or silver coinage, printing more paper money, or easing credit, meaning granting more loans to people. The increase in prices is a result of inflation, not its definition. So right now in our country, we're dealing with a good bit of inflation right now. Prices are rising as a result of inflation. Inflation is the increase of the money supply. Money was being printed during the COVID times. All of these stimulus monies that was giving out to people, all the extra unemployment benefits are giving out to people. This was all an increase in the money supply, which is inflation. And due to inflation, we are now dealing with higher prices. All right, so the rising inflation alarmed Jackson, especially in the great rise in prices for Western lands. Inflation is the increase in the money supply that causes a corresponding rise in prices. Since he would not use the bank to stabilize prices, Jackson asked the Treasury Department to issue the SPECIE circular. This ad required anyone who bought government lands to pay for them in specie, gold or silver coins, rather than in paper money. The SPECIE circular reduced the number of bank loans issued, but it also prohibited borrowers, including speculators, from paying their debts with their paper money. Soon, people did not trust paper money at all. More banks failed, and more farmers lost their lands. With no money for people to spend and no banks to borrow from, businesses failed. The economic crisis worsened. By the time Jackson's handpicked successor took office, the nation was suffering from an economic depression that would last 5 years. So we're in a tough place here economically coming out at the end of Jackson's presidency, and it left a bad place for his successor, Martin Van Buren, to be in. Martin Van Buren ended up being a one-term president, or as I call them sometimes, a one-hit wonder. He was only in there for one term. And a lot of that was due to the bad economic policies that was left due to Jackson. So the Jacksonian legacy. Although Jackson left office in 1837, his strong imprint remained. He greatly increased the powers of the executive branch. When challenged about the tariff by advocates of states' rights, he had staunchly defended the Union. But when Indian policy was the issue, he had favored the states and removed the Indians. He believed in free enterprise, yet his intrusion into a largely private bank led to economic panic. Despite these inconsistencies, the next few presidents, no matter their party, reflected Jackson's influence. A new party appeared in the election of 1836. The Whigs united several diverse groups into one party, mostly uniting over opposition to Jackson. The Whigs wanted the national government to promote a strong economy, through a national bank and a protective tariff. They also supported internal improvements. Many Northern Whigs saw slavery as sinful. The Whigs were more openly concerned about laws based on religion and morals. They applauded Sunday closing laws, and some wanted to outlaw alcohol. Martin Van Buren was Andrew Jackson's choice to succeed him as president in 1836. Van Buren had served as Jackson's vice president since 1832 when John C. Calhoun resigned. The Whigs, on the other hand, chose several candidates. In Tennessee, they ran Senator Hugh L. White. In the Middle Atlantic and Western states, General William Henry Harrison carried the Whig banner. Massachusetts chose Daniel Webster. Their strategy was to throw the election to the House by running strong sectional candidates. But the Whig strategy backfired. Van Buren received 51% of the popular vote, and his margin of victory in the Electoral College was comfortable. Van Buren was the first president who was not born a British subject, meaning he was born after the colonies won their independence. His family was Dutch and had never been prominent in society. Shortly after he took office, Van Buren faced the economic depression that began under Jackson. British trade and investments dropped off sharply. Cotton prices dropped from 15 cents to 6 cents a pound. The internal improvements stopped, throwing thousands of men out of work. Van Buren called Congress into special session to deal with the crisis. He suggested that the government end all contact with banks, both central and pet banks. The less government interference with private pursuits, the better for the general prosperity, he said. In Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, the state legislature took over building of roads and canals, but 9 other states failed to repay money owed on their bonds. Van Buren proposed an independent treasury system that would consist of a number of federal vaults and depositories. The treasury could collect and spend from these treasuries without using any banks. Gold and silver would be the mediums for all federal business. Congress adopted Van Buren's plan in 1840. One other important aspect of Van Buren's presidency was the changes in the Supreme Court during his term. Chief Justice John Marshall had died in 1835. His death allowed Jackson to appoint Roger B. Taney to the position. Jackson had also appointed 4 new associate justices in his term. In 1837, Van Buren was able to appoint 2 justices when vacancies occurred. All but one of these 7 new appointees were from southern states. With the new justices, Taney now had control of a new court. The Whigs were panic-stricken. They feared that the Democrat-dominated court would reverse all of Marshall's nationalist decisions. But Marshall's decision stood, and few dramatic changes occurred. With the election of 1840 came, the Democrats again chose Van Buren. Convinced that Clay would not attract Eastern voters, the Whigs turned to William Henry Harrison, a man not closely linked with either party. Harrison was a Southerner by birth and could attract Democratic votes in the South. He was also a military hero, known for his victory at Tippecanoe and his efforts in the War of 1812. Since his political views were unknown, those views could not hurt him. A careless comment by a Democrat that if Harrison was given a log cabin and a barrel of hard cider, he would retire on a pension, played directly into Whig hands. The Whigs soon began portraying Harrison, who was in reality wealthy, as a simple man of common taste. In contrast, they labeled Van Buren a snobbish aristocrat. The Whigs campaigned with gusto. Dressed as Indians, they played Harrison's victory over Tecumseh at the Battle of Tippecanoe. They served gallons of ciders to voters and put on parades complete with bands, banners, and flags. Voter turnout increased 60% in 1836. This increase, along with his war fame, helped Harrison and his running mate, John Tyler, win 19 of the 26 states and 53% of the popular vote. With campaign slogans such as Tippecanoe and Tyler too, Van is a used up man, and to guide the ship will trial tip, the Whig ticket put Van Buren out of office. No sooner had the 68-year-old Harrison taken office than disaster struck. While making the longest inaugural address in the nation's history, Harrison caught a cold. Even before Congress convened, the cold turned into pneumonia. Just 4 weeks after Harrison took office, he died. He was the first president to die while in office. So that made his vice president become the president. He was the first vice president to become president after the death of his predecessor. He was a Whig in name only. He had disagreed with Jackson on nullification and the removal of bank deposits, but he also disagreed with most of the Whig policies. He soon clashed with members of his own cabinet and party. Henry Clay said that since Tyler had not been elected president, he should let a congressional committee of Whigs make crucial decisions. Clay, of course, intended to head the committee. Tyler, however, had a mind of his own, and he knew what the Constitution said. He was unquestionably the right president. Meanwhile, Clay took charge of the Whig program in Congress. He abolished the independent treasury system. He also pushed through a new land act called the Preemption Act of 1841 that allows squatters, which are settlers without titles to the land, to buy Western lands when the lands came up for public sale. When the national debt increased, Tyler felt forced to sign a bill that raised the tariff back to its 1832 level. Clay then submitted a bill establishing a new national bank. Tyler vetoed it as unconstitutional and beneficial only to the Northeast. The Whigs, who were already calling Tyler his accidency because of how he gained office, now turned on the president and expelled him from the party. All the Whigs in Tyler's cabinet resigned except Daniel Webster. Webster only remained because he wanted to complete negotiation with British over a border dispute. Tyler became a man without a party. So that border dispute that Webster was negotiating with. In foreign affairs, Tyler's administration faced problems with Britain. Daniel Webster and Lord Ashburton, a British diplomat, met to resolve these matters. The resulting treaty, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842, was a compromise. The U.S. gave portions of Maine to Canada, and the U.S. gave additional land in the northern New York and Vermont, as well as lands on Lake Superior to northeastern Minnesota. The treaty drew the boundary line between the U.S. and Canada from the Lake of the Woods east to the Atlantic. As soon as the Senate ratified the treaty, Webster resigned, joining the other Whig leaders in their protest against President Tyler. When Tyler's cabinet resigned, he created a power base of his own by placing Southern Whigs in the vacant cabinet seats. His final goal was to add Texas to the Union. He sought this goal partly because he believed that Texas would aid his reelection. But his early efforts failed. Texas remained outside the Union, and Democrat James K. Polk won the election of 1844. During Tyler's lame duck period, which is the time between the election and his leaving office, he kept promoting the admission of Texas. When the Senate refused to ratify a treaty to annex Texas by the required 2/3 vote, Tyler proposed that Texas be admitted by a joint resolution. The resolution, which required only a simple majority vote, passed. By the end of Tyler's presidency, many Americans longed for the return of a strong leader like Andrew Jackson. Harrison had won the election of 1840 because of popular opinion against Jackson's policies and those of Van Buren, his successor. But for some Americans, Presidents Harrison and Tyler had been far too weak. All right, and that is the end of chapter 10. So tomorrow you will review for your chapter 10 test, and then you'll take your chapter 10 test on Wednesday. So have a good rest of your day.